Hey, here are 5 stupid things I've noticed about the men's rights movement.
Hi, Steve. I'm Jim, and I advocate for human rights, not just for women, but also for men and children. So naturally, when I saw your latest bigoted rant of unsubstantiated accusations towards the men's rights movement, I just had to make this video. And luckily for humanity, Dr. Randomercam and Tealdeer already made 2 brilliant responses, which just makes it easier for me to make my first ever response video to you. Now, granted, Dr. Randomercam's response was probably funnier than mine's going to be, and Tealdeer's was probably more informative. But I hope this is entertaining nonetheless. Also, I may have to record this video incrementally, because I'm afraid that if I try to do it all in one sitting, the authorities will find my lifeless body in this chair, with my radius and ulna lodged firmly in my frontal lobe from face-palming myself to death. Steve?
It's misogynistic. This is the one inescapable fact about the men's rights movement that makes it impossible for me to support.
Oh, so it's an inescapable fact now, is it? Not just a baseless assertion? Well, then you should have no problem providing evidence for it. But you're not going to do that, are you?
Are there legitimate issues raised by reasonable voices within the movement?
Why, yes, Steve, there are. But you're going to shit all over the movement anyway, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Ah, I thought so. Go on.
And I'll talk about a few of those in a minute, but the movement itself is essentially misogynistic. And it's not even that it's actively anti-woman.
Okay, since feminists like using the dictionary so much because it's the only thing that they can use to back up their claim that they're for equality, let's just see what it says about misogyny. Misogyny. Noun. Dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women. Sounds pretty actively anti-woman to me. So tell me, Steve, is it misogynistic or is it not actively anti-woman? Because I think those two might be mutually exclusive.
And although some of it obviously is.
Okay, this might be a nitpick, but obviously is not proof or evidence. Quite the contrary, it's the kind of word one uses to gloss over any burden of proof for their claims, and declare that it's just common sense. This is exactly the kind of verbal tactic used by the religious to claim that the existence of their God is just a given, and that the masses ought not question it. You being a fellow atheist, I would imagine you wouldn't approve of such a sloppy assertion of opinion as fact.
Most of it isn't the misogyny of the wife-beater or the determined sexist. It's the blindness, the insensitivity of men who can't or won't look beyond their own interests.
It's funny you should say that, Steve, because some of the issues covered by the men's rights movement either don't apply to me or wouldn't help me. Yet I support them anyway. For example, I'm single and don't plan on having any children in the foreseeable future. Yet I still think that child support is an unfair practice in how it forces a man to work and give his earnings to the mother, and how it results in incarceration for men who either refuse to pay or can't afford to. I'll get to the other big one that doesn't apply to me a little later.
It's the senseless panic of men who view every feminist gain as a masculine loss.
That depends entirely on what that gain is. If, for example, it's the right to vote, equal opportunities for education and employment, or reproductive rights, I consider those to be gains for humanity as a whole. Because I believe that we should live in an egalitarian society where people are treated equally by the law and given all the same rights and opportunities. Notice I said opportunities, not outcomes. If, however, feminists were to gain for women the ability to throw a man in jail simply because she cried rape, I would consider that an affront to due process and a blatant violation of innocent until proven guilty. Listen and believe, Steve. That's what it means.
Here are a few examples of the sort of misogynistic things I've noticed about the men's rights movement.
Oh good, there are examples! I was beginning to think we weren't going to get past the baseless assertions in number 1.
It attacks feminine privilege while ignoring male privilege. This whole concept of feminine privilege is hilarious to me.
Oh, it's a laugh riot, Steve! But I won't get into that now. Let's hear what else you have to say about it.
It's not that I deny that feminine privilege exists.
Okay, you don't deny it exists, but the concept is hilarious to you. Whatever, go on.
In our culture. It's just that I think it's absurd to try and equate it with male privilege. The benefits of feminine privilege include having men pay for your drinks and open doors for you. The benefits of male privilege include getting to run the motherfucking world.
Rich people run the world, Steve. Gender has fuck all to do with it. Also, you missed quite a few things in that short little list of benefits of female privilege. Namely, the right to intact genitals, the right to not be forced to go to war and die for your government's corporate interests, a wide variety of reproductive rights beyond just, if you don't want to have a baby, don't have sex, or just use a condom, which is all men get, by the way. The benefit of being believed by default when claiming to be the victim of sexual assault or domestic violence, the benefit of having people argue that you are physically incapable of committing one of the most heinous acts known to man, that would be rape, and the benefit of having statutory rape laughed off, well, you can easily turn it around and claim that the teenage boy you were fucking was in fact raping you. I may have missed a few, but I think you get the idea.
I think I'd rather pay for my own drinks. It seeks to minimize concern over domestic violence.
No, it doesn't, Steve. It seeks to raise awareness to the fact that not all perpetrators of domestic violence are male, and not all victims of it are female. Ironically, it's you that's about to attempt to minimize concerns over domestic violence by claiming that over half of the victims don't exist. By the way, I'll link Teal Deer's video in the description because he actually provides the statistics for his arguments, unlike you, Steve.
Sure, violence against women is terrible, says the men's rights movement member, feigning half-assed interest in the issue he's about to try to undermine. But what about violence against men? You never hear about that.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that you hear about domestic violence against men. Unless it's by people like you, who laugh it off as not being that big a deal, or at least not a significant or common problem. Which, coincidentally, is exactly what you're doing here.
As though there's this silent epidemic of woman-on-man domestic abuse.
If it's silent, which is to say that it goes largely unreported, then how are you so confident that there isn't?
And you know what? Maybe there is.
Aha! There is some semblance of rational thought in that pretty little head of yours.
And if so, that's a terrible thing. I don't support anyone beating up anyone as a general principle. Yes, I will take that bold stance.
Congratulations. Truly you are the most courageous defender of equality in this dark and unfair world. Someone should give you a fucking Nobel Peace Prize.
All we know for sure about woman-on-man domestic abuse is there are far, far fewer reported incidents of it than man-on-woman domestic abuse.
Citation needed. Especially since the study that Teal Deer cited in his response video to you blatantly contradicts that statement.
And if there really is this epidemic, if wives really are beating up their husbands as often as many within the men's rights movement suggest, why aren't more of these husbands coming forward to report these crimes?
I don't know. Maybe because of people like you, Steve. People who won't take them seriously, will laugh at them, or will minimize their suffering by saying, "That's nothing! Look what all these battered women have to go through! You should just man up!" Steve, this is, as Teal Deer pointed out, victim blaming at its finest. And I doubt that you would treat female victims who don't come forward the same way. But hey, that's just your feminist double standard talking.
Could it possibly be because of the same misogynistic macho bullshit that created the men's rights movement in the first place? That these husbands don't want to come forward and report their wives because they feel like getting beaten up by a woman makes them less of a man? Because they're not supposed to beat us up. It's supposed to be the other way around, right?
Those are some really fucking brazen accusations there, Steve. Especially when you consider that most men won't lay a hand on a woman because it's practically the other golden rule. And in the rare cases it does happen, like, I don't know, in the elevator during a drunken argument after the woman takes several flailing swings at her significant other, the media shitstorm descends on him and makes him the villain of the week. But when actress Emma Roberts hospitalized her boyfriend, actor Evan Peters, there was not a fucking peep about it in the media. I wonder why that is, Steve.
Here's what I do know for sure. CASA runs a shelter for battered women in Hagerstown, near where I live. There's a waiting list.
And the shelter for battered men is busy not existing.
Here are two more stupid things about the men's rights movement. It discredits efforts to address serious issues.
No. It seeks to address serious issues that people like you prefer to sweep under the rug because they don't jive with your religion. But go on.
My problem with the men's rights movement is with the movement as a whole. I don't automatically reject every issue that might be raised from within it. For example, there are some in the MRM who have pointed out that it's unfair that men in the United States have to register with selective service when they turn 18, while women don't have to. I agree. Others have suggested that family courts might be unfairly biased in favor of mothers and against fathers when it comes time to deciding things like child custody. I think that's a serious issue. And again, I think we as a society should be just as intolerant of domestic abuse that victimizes men as we have become, relatively recently, I would like to point out, of domestic violence that victimizes women.
So, you agree with three of the biggest issues raised by the men's rights movement, and yet you think it's stupid and misogynistic? Interesting. Also, you missed possibly the biggest one, but I'll get to that in a minute.
It's just that it would be a lot easier to stir people to positive action on these issues if they weren't being raised by a movement that is essentially a petulant, sexist reaction to feminism.
Are you implying that feminism isn't reactionary? Because lately all I see from feminists are reactions to something in the news or in some entertainment medium, usually decrying that something as being sexist or misogynist, without really explaining why. Even so, you yourself have admitted that the men's rights movement raises some good points. So is it really a valid argument to say fuck the whole thing just because you personally see it as an attack on your ideology? It's a rights movement, Steve. Its primary concern is granting rights to men that we are currently being denied. Feminism really has nothing to do with it. Sorry, Steve, but not everything is about your religion.
It's unnecessary. If they care about equality, why do they call themselves feminists?
Oh, I can answer this. It's because they've deluded themselves into thinking that men have all the power in society and that women are constantly oppressed by them. The idea is that men have all the good stuff and women must gradually change society so that they have all the same good stuff. This mindset is unfortunate for two reasons. First and foremost, because it is a lie based on a false dichotomy. Men do not have all the power, and in some cases there are in fact rights that men don't have that they really should in a fair and just society. The second reason is that rather than earning equal pay, for example, many would rather just not work for anything and take what they can away from men. And there's not a fear-mongering, guilt-tripping, ideology-spreading lie they won't tell in order to do so.
I've actually had people ask me this question, and the answer is because women that is, members of the feminine sex, are the group of people that has historically been mistreated and are now seeking rights equal to the group that mistreated them. Feminism is still necessary because women are still treated unequally in our culture relative to men.
Exactly. They're treated better.
The men's rights movement is unnecessary and ridiculous because we, that is, those of us with penises...
There it is! Alright, I'll let you finish your sentence before I go into my tirade, but that's what I was waiting for.
...dominate business, government, religion, you name it.
Yeah, women have the same opportunities to go into those fields, they just choose not to, by and large. Anyway, penises, Steve? It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's something I'd like to clarify. Now, when you say that, Steve, do you mean whole penises? Because not all of us have those. As it happens, Steve, many of us look down at our bait and tackle and see a surgical scar running all the way around it, because our parents thought it was okay to tell the doctor after we were born, hey, cut off that flappy part, it looks better that way. And by virtue of us being newborn babies, we were unable to speak out against this legally sanctioned mutilation of our most tender body part. And we were equally unable to consent to it. Ask yourself something, Steve, and don't answer aloud because I don't really need to know. But ask yourself, are you one of us? Did you also have your genitals mutilated against your consent when you were less than a week old? Because if the answer is yes, you just might want to consider lending a bit of your free time to the men's rights movement that you are so dismissively decrying as stupid here. Even if the answer is no, you might still want to, for the sake of all the babies who are yet to be born. Because it may be too late for us, but it's not too late for them.
And we always have. We've never had to face what women have to face.
And vice versa, Steve. That's what empathy is for.
Being paid less, offered fewer opportunities.
Earning less despite having the same opportunities.
Punished for our personal ambition and assertiveness.
You mean being called bossy? Because male or female, I'd say get the fuck over it.
Being treated as less capable just because of what sex we are.
Do you mean like how men are seen as less capable of raising children on their own?
And barring some unforeseen and overwhelming victory by radical feminism,
we'll still have freedom of speech?
We never will.
Good point, Steve. I just edited you into saying something true.
The men's rights movement isn't about gender equality. It's about tipping the inequality even more in the favor of men.
Replace the men's rights movement with feminism, and men with women, and you've got yourself another true statement there. You're on a roll here, Steve. You just have to flip the script.
So fuck it. The hardest part is only picking 5. Catch you next time.
I agree. It's hard to pick 5 stupid things about something when you don't understand it. Good riddance. Oh, fuck me! Alright, go ahead.
Hey, so I recently held a poll with my Patreon patrons.
No one cares, Steve. Get to the point.
Here are 5 more stupid things about the men's rights movement.
I'm sure this will be just as riveting and insightful as the first half.
Selective acceptance. Men's rights activists don't typically exhibit terribly positive attitudes toward women.
Yeah, nice self-description, asshole. Look, I don't get the joke behind deriding a particular article of headwear, but at least in the most literal sense, us ball cap wearing folks are not inherently superior. And more to the point of what you're saying, being a men's rights activist has nothing to do with how one feels about or acts towards women. So maybe some might be assholes, but I would wager that most of them are actually quite decent people when you look past the bad publicity that the label is getting from people like you and actually get to know them.
But there are exceptions. For example, women who agree with them.
And feminists are A-OK with men who disagree with them, aren't they, Steve? Oh wait, those people are called MRAs, and every time a group of them gets together and speaks publicly, feminists get them kicked out, pull the fire alarm, stage large angry protests, and basically do whatever it takes to silence them.
That feminism is at best unnecessary and at worst oppressive and misandrist.
Funny little note. While I was transcribing your words into an organized script for what I wanted to say in response, Microsoft Word did not recognize misandrist as a real word. It does, however, recognize the word misogynist. And I double-checked my spelling on Google and everything, but it still gave me the red squiggly line. I wonder why.
Or, no, you know what? That's it. Women who reject feminism are highly favored by MRAs. They're held up as evidence that theirs is a legitimate ideology based on facts and reasonable assumptions, not a hate movement based on projection, fears of inadequacy, and unhinged misogyny.
Again with the spurious accusations and baseless assertions, Steve. If you want people to take you seriously, you're going to have to start showing some evidence. Keep that in mind because that sentiment is only going to get stronger later in the video. Also, it's not an ideology, it's a rights movement, Steve. An ideology is what you have. And as it happens, I think that men who reject the men's rights movement are highly favored by feminists, and that they are held up as evidence that feminism is a legitimate ideology based on facts and reasonable assumptions, rather than a hate group based on projection, fears of inadequacy, and unhinged misandry. Again, Microsoft Word doesn't recognize the word. See, two can play this game, Steve. Also, men who reject the men's rights movement. I think I know one of those.
Anyway, if MRAs hate women so much, why are there women who agree with them?
Maybe because MRAs don't hate women, and because we raise some valid arguments, unlike you, Steve.
Funny how that same logic doesn't seem to apply to men who support feminism.
Because feminists seem to hate everything, Steve. At least the kinds of feminists I'm talking about. You know the type, the Tumblr, social justice, professional blogger types whose primary interests are being offended at things for being sexist and claiming to be victims of harassment the very second someone disagrees with them or leaves a troll comment. Yeah, they hate everything. They hate fun, they hate sexuality, they hate freedom of speech, they hate biology, they hate meritocracy, and above all, they hate men, as they blame all their problems on the mythical patriarchy. Those people don't want to be equal to men. They want to enslave them.
Dishonest denial. One of the most interesting phenomena surrounding the men's rights movement is how many men will strenuously deny having any association with it, even while parroting its talking points.
You mean like you did? Steve, you cannot be this utterly lacking in self-awareness. In your first video about the men's rights movement, you agreed with 3 talking points of the movement and failed to mention a 4th that, for all I know, you might also agree with. You said selective service was unfair, the family court system was biased, and that domestic abuse should not be tolerated no matter the gender of the victim. You didn't mention circumcision, but is it unreasonable for me to think that you, being a fellow atheist, would oppose it? Since, after all, you have no religious reason not to. Steve, how is what you're describing any different than what you yourself are doing in these 2 videos?
And really, who can blame them? The men's rights movement is so toxic, so obviously fueled by bigotry and male insecurity that even people who agree with everything MRAs typically say don't want to be taken for one.
Yeah, like you. you racist, homophobic, Nazi sympathizer. See, I too can throw around baseless accusations and fail to provide a shred of evidence for a single one of them. It doesn't make them true, and of course I'm just saying them to make a point. But have you ever considered that people don't identify as MRAs because they're not too fond of the shit that people like you, Steve, throw at them? Ironically, in the very same sentence as wondering why they don't just identify with the label you happen to be shitting on. Your head is full of spiders, Steve. Big, hairy, venomous spiders. Your mind must be a terrifying place to live in.
Luckily, if you're a guy who is sick and tired of being called an MRA when you're not one, there's a real easy fix. Just stop being such a sexist crybaby. Try it. You might be surprised how well that works for you.
And you should try eating batteries, you insufferable douche.
Harassment of critics. The men's rights movement is reactionary by its very nature. It lashes out at women and feminists in particular.
I refer you to my previous statements about the kinds of feminists who make a career out of calling everything sexist. Feminists like the ones you're about to mention by name.
On a daily basis, feminist writers and activists are
Activists, right.
deluged with hate mail and death threats from outraged men.
Yeah, $5 words aside, I think that just comes with the territory of entering a little place called the internet. It doesn't make it okay, but neither does it make said threats credible, as most of them almost certainly aren't. But it gets better. Just listen.
Some, like Lindy West or Anita Sarkeesian, are arguably better known for being victims of misogynist harassment than for their actual work.
Oh, Steve. First of all, misogynist.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Secondly, I'm not too familiar with Lindy West, admittedly, but I am all too familiar with Anita Sarkeesian. And I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that being the victim of misogynist harassment is her actual work. All the misinformed bullshit she spews about alleged sexism in every single video game on the market, that's just how she baits her hook for her real meal ticket. The trolls who get their kicks out of making fun of her. Notice that her donations get a big spike from things like her appearance on Nightline, where she played the victim, the social media nonsense that emerged from her reaction to the selfie she was pictured in as proof that Ben of the Drunken Peasants podcast was in the same place as her, by complete coincidence, and various other times when she has, rather ironically, played the role of a damsel in distress. And I have nothing against Anita personally, but her methods are dishonest and her arguments are fallacious. And she is quite worthy of the term professional victim, because she profits off of the gullibility of people like you.
Others have been driven from the public sphere altogether, which is understandable, but is also a terrible shame, because that's what the harassers want. Unable to intelligently answer their critics, they attempt to intimidate them into silence.
It's funny you should mention that, Steve, because I just so happen to know of a certain brigade of Mellivora that was kicked out of a conference for nothing more than criticizing the feminist narrative. I also happen to know of a men's rights event that was heavily disrupted by a mob of feminists, seemingly led by a crimson-haired nightmare that also happens to be the most unpleasant human being whose likeness and voice have ever been recorded and uploaded to the internet. I mean, besides you, of course, Steve.
And when that doesn't work, when they are unable to overwhelm feminists with the sheer force of abuse, they resort to other equally vapid tactics, like derailment and distraction. Many MRAs engage in a sort of troll guerrilla warfare.
How do you know they're MRAs, Steve? Do you ask? Do they identify as such? And even if they are, how does that discredit the legitimacy of the arguments that you've already conceded agreement on?
infiltrating the comment sections of articles and videos that deal with women's issues, posting responses designed to paralyze discussion with irrelevant bickering.
Okay, so putting aside that many of the points made by MRAs are not, in fact, irrelevant bickering, i.e. baby mutilation, conscription to war, and child custody, how exactly does any comment paralyze discussion? I mean, it's not like telling someone to shut the fuck up, like that angry Australian who also advocates feminism does all the time. It's not like you actually have to listen to them. If it's truly irrelevant troll comments and not actual discussion points that just happen to disagree with you, then just ignore them and continue the debate civilly with those who are respectful to both sides. Although, by that logic, I probably shouldn't even be talking to you right now, Steve.
Demands that feminists identify legal rights available to men but not to women are common.
Yeah, and that's because you can't fucking do it, can you, Steve? If you could do it, they probably wouldn't be asking now, would they? I, on the other hand, can name 3 legal rights that women have and men do not. Bodily autonomy, reproductive autonomy, and parental autonomy. That is to say, practically all the birth control modern science can offer is made available to them. Their children are in their custody by default and rarely removed without a good reason, and their genitals aren't hacked to pieces as soon as they're born. I'd say those are pretty big rights, and that's just off the top of my head.
There's also the ever-popular appeal to bigger problems, in which the MRA will express his dismay that feminists aren't more concerned with the plight of women in developing countries or the Muslim world. It's not that he gives a shit about those women, he just thinks that feminists should worry more about them and leave sexist American assholes like him alone.
Okay, to be fair, I agree that this can be a cop-out, and I think that there are enough people in the world to help each other with all problems, great and small. Of course, it takes more people to solve bigger problems generally, but that's beside the point. The reason for pointing this out is more along the lines of women being legitimately oppressed in those regions, and there being more of a legitimate claim to patriarchy, rape culture, etc., in places like the Congo than in the United States of America, where feminist complaints of sexism and misogyny are pitifully trivial by comparison. I don't agree with it 100%, but I see their point in bringing it up.
Still, this isn't the worst thing about the men's rights movement. When it comes to that, it's hard to get more disgusting and inexcusable than rape apology.
Oh, you mean like the rape apology that makes the argument that women are incapable of raping men because rape requires penetration? Or perhaps do you mean the rape apology of people on Twitter laughing about a man in South Africa who was raped by 3 women at gunpoint because the idea of women raping men is oh so hilarious? What about the rape apology of statutory rape cases in which a female teacher molests a male student and it's either laughed off as a joke or she turns it around by accusing him of raping her? Clearly, that must be the disgusting and inexcusable rape apology you're referring to, right? Oh wait, all of those are examples of rape apology by women and feminists!
Men's rights activists attempt to minimize or dismiss concerns about rape in a variety of ways.
You mean like pointing out that some rape accusations are false because sometimes the accuser is either mistaken about who attacked her, what actually happened, what consent is, etc., or because there may be, just maybe, a vindictive woman scorned, i.e. jealous ex or obsessed stalker or something like that? Or perhaps do you mean by pointing out the fact that not all rapists are men and not all rape victims are women? Either way, Steve, that doesn't minimize or dismiss concerns about rape. If anything, it raises some concerns that all too often go unheard.
Ignoring the existence of acquaintance and spousal rape.
Citation needed, Steve. I have never heard a men's rights activist say anything even remotely like that. And if one has, I would like them to be pointed out to me so that I can unleash upon them even more rage than I am currently letting loose on you. So by all means, citation please.
Blaming rape victims for being promiscuous or dressing too provocatively, spreading fear and paranoia about a non-existent epidemic of false rape allegations,
Rolling Stone says what?
and generally acting as though making rape an easier crime for men to get away with is their primary goal, which it is.
Women already get away with rape because people like you pretend that it doesn't happen. And because the justice system is already biased against men whenever the word rape is uttered. Honestly, I'm an atheist, but I can't call it anything other than a miracle that the UVA rape case didn't result in the entire fraternity being brought up on charges, on one woman's say-so. Because upon hearing the story, the public at large was prepared to lynch every last one of those boys. To my knowledge, the female rapists in South Africa are still at large. And as for your assertion about what you think the primary goal of the men's rights movement is, well, it isn't even worth the dignity of a response, Steve. You are, without a doubt, the most reprehensible human being that I have ever had the displeasure of listening to.
This is not a civil rights movement as it claims to be. This is a hate group, populated by resentful failures too weak to carry their own baggage. They're some of the most pathetic human beings known to me, and their only redeeming quality is that they're so much damn fun to smack around, which is fitting since most of them seem to think that's all women are good for.
Steve, you have gone beyond schoolyard bully levels of childishness and mean-spiritedness. You have descended into the darkest, most cavernous depths of human depravity. There are no words adequate enough to describe you, Steve. I personally make people earn being called cunt by being among the vilest, most hate-filled, bile-spewing, bigoted fearmongers I've ever encountered. On the short list so far are people like Brian Fisher and the aforementioned crimson-haired nightmare known apparently as Big Red. But you, Steve, for you, the word cunt just isn't strong enough. The lint I find in my belly button gets more respect from me than you do at this point. You are not just a piece of shit, Steve. You are a mountain of toxic waste expelled from the sphincter of the very last segment of a 100-person long human centipede!
The hardest part is only picking 5. Catch you next time.
There is no sign-off that I could come up with that would contain the amount of fuck you that I'm feeling right now, Steve. If I never see you again, I'll still hear the screaming. Hi, Steve. 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 Steve.